All right, so on this video, we're going to start off by watching a quick YouTube video. And I wanted to do it like this because I wanted to kind of force you to watch it because I think you will think it's interesting. It relates to what we are doing right now in this chapter. Okay.
Are sausages in a roll. It's likely that German sausage makers came up with the idea. German immigrants were selling them from pushcarts in New York's Bowery as far back as the 1860s. A century and a half later, hot dogs are still big on the street. To make standard hot dogs, they use a mix of pork, beef, and chicken. The cuts they use are called trimmings, pieces of meat left over from cutting steaks or pork chops, and they're mainly muscle tissue. They grind the trimmings the same way butchers grind hamburger meat, by pushing the cuts through a metal plate pierced with holes. They add processed chicken trimmings to the ground meat, then mixing food starch, salt, and other flavorings. The starch thickens the mix while the flavorings vary depending on where the hot dogs are to be sold, because people in different regions have different tastes. They spray water into the mix and blend everything together in a big rectangular vat. A dash of clear corn syrup adds sweetness. They mix in more water, which helps disperse the ingredients and make the hot dogs juicier. Another machine then shreds the meat batter into a fine emulsion and vacuums out any air. They load rolls of cellulose tubing into the stuffing machine. It pumps the meat puree into a long casing, twisting it every 13 centimeters, the length of one hot dog. It takes just 35 seconds to make a chain of hot dogs that would span a football pitch twice. Then, they link 3 of those hot dog chains for an even longer string and load several at a time into another machine, which drapes the hot dogs onto moving racks. It's all carefully timed so that a twist always lands on the bar. The racks shunt the hot dogs through a liquid smoke shower, then through an oven with several cooking zones. The liquid smoke seeps through the casing and adds flavor to the dogs as they bake. Hot out of the oven, they drench these franks in very cold and salty water to chill them in preparation for packaging. The hot dogs then file down to an unloading zone. Here, a machine pulls them off the bars onto a conveyor. The hot dogs slide off the conveyor into metal containers. If you've been wondering what those black stripes are on the casings, all is about to be revealed. Or should we say, unveiled. The stripe is a marker. When they strip off that casing, the absence of a black stripe means that the hot dog is done and ready for packaging. Inside the peeler machine, a tiny knife slits each casing along the top. Then steamy air blows the casings right off the dogs. This machine peels 700 hot dogs every minute. The inspector checks to make sure the casing has been completely removed and that there are no defects. Then it's into a device that looks like a plastic bicycle chain. The sprockets position the hot dogs for packaging. They manufacture an incredible 300,000 hot dogs an hour. That's close to 2.5 million per shift. So they really do churn them out like it's a sausage factory. Which, of course, it is. Good thing, really. Means lunch shouldn't be a problem.
All right, so we're done with hot dogs. I hope that didn't gross you out too much. This is one of my favorites with the aluminum foil.
The manufacture of aluminum foil requires the repeated thinning out of a large block of aluminum. We begin by melting ingots of 100% pure aluminum in a natural gas furnace. These ingots, called pigs, are essential in alloys with zinc, titanium, and silica. It takes 3 to 8 hours to melt 27,000 kilos of aluminum in this remelting furnace, which operates at 750 degrees centigrade. Fusion temperature of aluminum is 660 degrees centigrade. A portion of aluminum is poured into this small mold to make a sample. Solidifying in just seconds, the sample allows for testing to verify the contents of the prepared alloy. This trough is used to transfer the aluminum from the remelting furnace to the tapping well. Molten aluminum runs in a movable trough located above the tapping well. At this stage, impurities are filtered out in special receptacles. The molds are cooled with water to accelerate the solidification of the molten aluminum. Ingots are unmolded and are ready for milling. Each ingot is massive, measuring 4.4 meters in length, 1.4 meters in width, and is 45 centimeters thick. It weighs a whopping 7,500 kilos, so it has to be handled by overhead cranes and placed on special plates. This crust removing machine removes 3 millimeters of the ingot's thickness. Impurities are eliminated to achieve a perfectly smooth finish. All traces of the liquid used to cool the decrusting knives have to be eliminated. The many steps in the thinning of the ingot begins. The aluminum block is crushed by the hot mill rollers. Temperatures in the rollers are between 455 and 540 degrees centigrade. Pressure on the ingot is continually verified by a technician. If too great, it's lowered and the technician then adjusts the pressure. The heat is so high that the ingot risks sticking to the mill's roller. To prevent this, everything is cooled with a liquid that's 95% water and 5% oil. Starting from a thickness of 45 centimeters, the ingot becomes increasingly thinner with each pass-through. Depending on requirements, the ingot will go through the machine between 12 and 16 times. The ingot now measures 7 centimeters in thickness. It has to get down to just half a centimeter. At this stage, the ingot is 5 centimeters thick and measures a little over 9 meters in length. This conveyor transports the plate during its milling stages. The ingot has now become a 5 millimeter thick sheet. It is sufficiently thin to proceed to spooling, where it spools onto itself before being sent to the cold rolling mill, where its thickness will be reduced still further. The aluminum sheet has become very thin now and risks being broken by the tension needed for cold rolling, so the sheet is doubled to avoid this breakage. One final reduction in the mill, and the sheet will have the thickness required by the customer. A liquid coolant is used to prevent the foil from sticking to the rollers. Since the edges of the foil sheet are lightly damaged and crinkled, a knife removes a 1 centimeter thin strip. Finally, the roll is cut to the desired width And one huge ingot has produced foil measuring 12.7 kilometers in length.
All right, so got a little taste of my favorite show. I love how it's made. It is one of my favorites. But we're going to jump over here and we're going to finish up this chapter. So, learning objective 3, 4, and 5 is going to be on this video. And we're going to talk about how the financial statements look a little bit different than a merchandising business. Okay, so on our balance sheet, the service company actually carries no inventory. If you'll remember, we had like a service company, it didn't have inventory, mainly because like a service company is going to be more like a CPA firm, an engineering firm, a law firm. They don't really have inventory. They have the people that work for them, their brain that will provide a service. Okay. A merchandising business will have inventory. It is an asset. We call it merchandise inventory. And then the manufacturer will have those three inventory counts that I mentioned earlier. And I drew the T counts out for that raw materials inventory, work in process, and finished goods. So those two videos that we just watched, you can see where like the aluminum, the big block of, I think they call it an ingot, and that's the raw material. Okay, when they put the raw material on the assembly line, the work in process is our assembly line. When the foil comes off of it, nice and boxed up, ready to sell, it turns into finished goods. Okay, so here is balance sheet of all three types of companies. I usually only do two, the merchandising and the manufacturing, but you can see service company, no inventory. The merchandising business has one inventory count, but the manufacturing is going to have three different types of inventory. Those are those ones that I went over here. Okay. So I jumped back. All right. Our income statement's going to look a little bit different as well for a manufacturing business. And I do love that they give us all three of these. So you can see the service business is just service revenue and expenses. This is more of a single step income statement as well. You may remember that from Principles of Accounting 1. Then we get to the merchandising business, and we had that beginning merchandise inventory, add to it our purchases, freight in, gave us goods available for sale, subtract out the ending, and we get cost of goods sold. So remember I said in the previous video that the finished goods acts just like merchandise inventory, and you can see that exact same thing on that manufacturing income statement. Okay. They have a little thing here called cost of goods manufactured. Let's go fill that in on our little diagram here. Okay. Cost of goods manufactured leaves work in process, and then it gets added to finished goods. Okay. So when you're working these kind of problems, they're not going to give you all the information. They may give you the beginning and the ending balance, and they may want you to back into some of these numbers, but this is how you follow that process. If they ask you to do a cost of goods manufactured statement, do these three T accounts first. I promise it will help you quite a bit. Okay. So there we go. Now, you can kind of see the flow of the product cost in a manufacturing business. Here we have those raw materials inventory moves over to work in process. Those three things, direct materials, direct labor, manufacturing overhead, they all go into work in process. And then once it's finished, goes to finished goods, and then it turns into cost of goods sold. That diagram illustrates these exact T accounts that I have for you right here. Okay, so 3 steps to do cost of goods manufactured. Okay, calculate the direct materials, calculate the manufacturing cost, and then calculate cost of goods sold. Okay, so how are we going to calculate direct materials used? Okay, I urge you to go over there and do that T account, but I'm going to do the T account right here. for raw materials or direct materials. Okay. The beginning direct materials was 70,000. They purchased 350,000 of new raw materials, which gave us direct materials available for use. We don't necessarily need that in our T account. And then they told us that ending was 65. So we can back into this one way or the other. There's a couple of different ways we can do this. We can start with 65, work our way backwards, because remember this line right here is a balance line, okay? And I made it a race, okay? So we can start with 65,000. We can back up, but inevitably we would come up, no matter what kind of math we use, we would come up with 355,000 of raw materials that was moved over into work in process. Okay. A lot of these problems do not, they don't make you work them forwards because that would be too easy. A lot of these are going to make you work backwards. But if you think about it, when it comes to raw materials, it might be easier to back into what was used. Okay. It's very easy to know what our beginning balance was. We know what we purchased. We can go out there and count everything that's left in raw materials, and we know everything else left the building. So everything else left and went into work in process or goods in process. Those two mean the same thing. Okay. So that would be the direct materials that gets transferred over. Okay. They're usually going to tell you what direct labor is. Sometimes they're going to mix direct labor and indirect labor together, and you've got to know how to separate those out. Okay. So here is the cost of goods manufacturing. It's not quite a statement, but it looks very similar to the cost of goods manufactured statement. Like I said, if you go to do that, if I had to do one on the CPA exam right now, I'd go do all of my T accounts. Then I would do the statement and make it look nice and pretty because I see the T accounts, I understand them, I want to make sure I get them correct. Okay. So our three costs, we have our direct materials, direct labor, and our manufacturing overhead. Okay. That is our cost, our total manufacturing cost incurred during the year. Okay. Now to calculate the cost of goods manufactured, we can use this T account right here. Okay. I think I will do that. So let's look at work in process. We have the beginning. Just going to put that number in. I don't have enough room to label it. Total manufacturing cost incurred during the year, 607. That is broke out between direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. So those three together would be the 607. Okay. And then they tell us what the ending is. We would back into the cost of goods manufactured. Okay. And you would get the 660,000. Okay. Here is your schedule of cost of goods manufactured. Okay. So you have that reconciliation of the direct materials right here. Okay. They're just going to give you direct labor, but here's our direct materials calculation right there. They're going to give you direct labor, then manufacturing overhead, everything that went into that. And then we'll reconcile that finished goods like we just did in that T account. We're doing that right here. Okay. Then calculating cost of goods sold. If this is a brand new business, you want to draw the T account out for the finished goods. It's a brand new business, so there's nothing in the beginning balance. Okay. Nothing in the beginning balance. We know that 660,000 got moved over into finished goods from work in process. We know that because right there. Okay. And they only told us what the ending finished goods was 60,000. So we know that 600,000 left finished goods, and that when it leaves finished goods, it is cost of goods sold. Okay. So here we can look at the income statement for a manufacturing business. You can see they've reconciled that finished goods within that. You don't necessarily have to do that. Some of your problems may ask you to do that, but a lot of times it's just going to be that 600,000 as cost of goods sold. That's going to go there. There's probably not going to have this little reconciliation done right there. Okay. So here is the flow of those goods. I like my T accounts. This is just the T accounts. I've done that over here for you. Um, that's the prettier one that I wrote out, but all of that is right there. Okay. All right. Then, okay, let's come down here. All right. We can use this to calculate a per unit cost. They told us that they produced 2,200 tablets across $660,000. That means it costs $300 per tablet to produce. Okay. All right. The next objective, we're going to look at some trends that affect managerial accounting. Okay. So there is a shift towards service economy. We're here in the US, and a lot of times it is easier to it's cheaper to manufacture things in different countries because the labor cost is a lot cheaper. So I encourage you not to judge businesses that do that, because a lot of times they're doing that just so they can make a profit. Okay. I mean, everybody keeps buying cheap stuff from Walmart and Amazon. So guess what? Stuff is still going to be made in other countries. And I think that's okay. I don't feel like that takes away from the United States. I feel like it makes our economy shift to more of a service economy. It means that, our workers are going to become more educated so they can do other jobs. So I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I know that is just an opinion, but we do, as Americans, we keep buying cheap stuff from Amazon and China. So we're that's just the way it's going to be until people stop buying that. And to be honest, if you wanted to buy a shirt made in the USA, you could probably find that, but you probably will not find material that is made in the United States. There is almost none of that that goes on here. So I had a student one time brag about his shirt had made in the USA, and I was like, yeah, but probably the material was not made in the USA. Okay. So there's a global competition. We also have some time-based competition. We have enterprise resource planning. These are systems that integrate all of the company's data, and it helps them to be able to make decisions. Okay. E-commerce has allows companies to sell products to consumers around the world. Okay. Just-in-time management as an inventory tool. Just-in-time sounds like an amazing thing on paper. It is very hard to carry out in the real world. Probably Dell Computer is probably one of the places that has done that really well, but Dell Computer had to make everybody, all their vendors, move and have their headquarters close to them so that if they needed a chip for this or a keyboard for that, they had that vendor there. So it made just in time work a little bit better. So basically, just in time tries to eliminate as much inventory as possible. Frito-Lay done this a couple of years ago, and one of the reasons they did it was not necessarily to cut jobs, which it did do, but it allowed for them to make the chips from the time they left the plant to the time they got to the consumer. They wanted it to be fresher. Okay. So, so they don't have just a lot of warehouses that are just holding chips anymore. They have orders that are packaged, like one truck has an order that it's going to go to, and it's going to go put these orders at another, there's going to be another little site. It might be small, it might be large, and they'll put in one lane, one salesman's truck. They'll put everything in that lane. That salesman comes that day, that same day, grabs everything in their lane, loads it into their truck, and then they deliver it. So it makes the getting the chips faster. doesn't go to a warehouse and then put on a shelf, and then it doesn't wait for it to be picked. Okay, so not a lot of raw materials going into the chips, so that one's they're able to do that just a little bit easier. Okay, it sounds great on paper, but a lot of times it is very hard to carry out in real life. Okay. Total quality management. This is something a lot of businesses are looking at. They want to make sure that what they are producing is a quality product. Okay. And now I've kind of mentioned this before, like we expect our corporations to be good corporate citizens. We're not just looking at profits. Yes, we are looking at profits, but we're also looking at people and the planet. We don't want to support a corporation that is dumping toxic waste in the river. Okay. The movie Aaron Brockovich that was based on a true story about a town who a plant had not lined the bottom of some of their pools that had, and so it contaminated all the water, and lots of people were getting cancer. Um, so, they're looking at people and the planet also. Okay. So we expect corporations to be good corporate citizens now. Okay. Last learning objective, we are going to look at how we can use managerial in a service business. All of these things that we are talking about can be used in a service business. They are used in a service business. So, any CPA firm, if you're working at a CPA firm, when you're working on a product or you're working on a tax return or financial statements, your time has to be coded to what client are you working on. So they sometimes call that billable hours. And, they want you to always be having some billable hours. They don't want you just sitting there doing nothing. And that's how they track what you're doing. A friend of mine who, right when we graduated from college, she kind of showed me her log book that she kind of kept on her desk. I'm sure it's not a handwritten thing anymore, but you can definitely use a lot of these skills for manufacturing to apply to a service business because you do want to make sure that that client, what you are working on that client's books, you want to make sure you're billing them the appropriate amount. So a lot of times you are only getting paid so much an hour, but your time that the CPA firm is billing out would probably be worth a lot more than the hour they're paying you because that's the CPA firm. They are making money. Okay. All right, that is all for chapter 1 of managerial accounting. So I will see you in the next chapter.